Most people have a picture of what healed looks like. The old responses stop showing up, a trigger appears, and there's no response. The memory is still there, but the past stops pulling at the present the way it used to. And that is a reasonable thing to want. And part of why that picture is so hard to let go of is the word the research uses. So, the main mechanism behind most trauma treatment is called fear extinction. And that name does imply that the fear is being removed entirely, but extinction doesn't actually erase the original fear memory. What it's doing is building new safety learning alongside it, which ends up competing with the old threat learning. So when something relevant comes up, it's sort of this kind of tug of war where you want the safety learning to consistently win. So the real question isn't which side is stronger, it's which learning the brain can actually reach first when those moments do arrive. And that's part of why the extinguished fear can come back, is that the original threat learning is still there. A fear response that faded in one context can return after a stressful event or a new situation, or if enough time passes without that new learning actually being reinforced. So it's not a relapse into failure, it's the original survival learning reasserting itself before that newer safety learning can be retrieved. So in PTSD, the research has gotten more specific about where this breakdown tends to occur. And it's more precise than saying extinction doesn't work, because people with PTSD can often show reduced fear responses within a therapy session. The response diminishes with those repeated safe exposures, and then the problem tends to appear later. So the safety learning that formed in the session doesn't always consolidate in a way that's accessible the next day. And the brain region most consistently implicated in this is the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. So the way I find that's easiest to visualize this is to imagine this sort of middle section. This is the bottom view of a brain. And then apply this midline section. So it's kind of this interior, slightly thick section of the prefrontal cortex that's implicated in this. So in most people, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex consolidates safety memories and makes them retrievable across different contexts. In PTSD, it tends to be underactive during extinction, and the safety memory formed in a session doesn't always encode in a way that holds elsewhere. So the problem isn't only that the threat learning was strong, it's that the safety learning does have trouble getting retrieved and winning that sort of neural tug-of-war in certain contexts and under pressure. So if progress means the old response goes quiet, the brain is almost always going to look like it's failing, because that old learning was built under survival conditions or perceived survival conditions. And a brain that releases that high confidence threat learning too quickly is going to be exposing itself to those situations that it was built to prevent. So the fact that the old response keeps showing up isn't evidence that something's going wrong. It's the brain and the nervous system doing what it learned to do. So the measure isn't whether the old response is gone, it's whether the newer learning is gaining enough weight to get there first. So those are very different questions, and measuring by the wrong one sets a standard the brain it's not designed to meet, right? Once you understand those underlying systems and modules. And even understanding all of this doesn't automatically change it. You can understand exactly why the response happens and still feel the body bracing, because The cognitive understanding and the somatic, the bodily understanding, are different systems as well. And that's a description of how fear learning and conceptual understanding use different pathways, with insight traveling along one route, and then what was learned through repeated embodied experience, it tends to require evidence of that same kind to update. So a better argument or a clear explanation isn't what the brain is looking for at that level. That's why the trauma therapies with the strongest evidence base focus on creating conditions for that new learning and having repeated safe contact with feared material. And it sort of is trying to give opportunities for those old threat predictions to encounter evidence it can't fully absorb, and to have those old expectations be tested and not hold true. So the approach varies depending on the person a little bit, but what holds across approaches is a consistent principle that the old learning updates by having something new to learn from, not by being told the correct answer. And the clearest version of that is repeated safe contact with feared material with enough time for that new learning to consolidate. So single exposures or exposures where avoidance stays partially intact might not give the brain enough to build durable safety learning from. And for some people, the evidence does need to be bodily. Having a previously activating situation paired with a different body state or level of arousal is something that can help reach the prediction on a level where that reasoning alone might not. And when the trauma arrived through other people, through things like threat, betrayal, situations where there's an absence of protection, that's where the social prediction may need social input to update as well. Some of that evidence may need to be relational, and it's not just arriving at the conclusion that people can be safe, but having enough actual contact with feeling safe in social situations that the prediction starts to change. So these are different routes that the brain can receive evidence that the old prediction didn't hold. And those specific paths and, treatment plans do sort of vary as a result. The learning that needs to change was at some point accurate, and the threat model and the confidence it carries do reflect the quality of the evidence it was built on. So recovery can take time. The slowness is a consequence of how serious that threat learning was, right? And it's a biological process. The pace isn't set only by how hard someone's trying. It depends on how much new evidence has accumulated and how consistently that evidence contradicts the old prediction. And, it has to encode in a way that's retrievable when that old prediction shows up again. So effort matters in the sense of continued engagement with the conditions that allow that new learning to form. But it's not really in the sense that you try harder to feel differently, because the memories need time to encode. Time is pretty important. Outlearning doesn't mean the past becomes irrelevant or that what happened should have left less of a mark than it did. At the level of the mechanism, it means the old prediction gradually loses that automatic authority it once had, and that sort of like game of tug-of-war has the safety learning coming out on top. So what changes is enough new experience in the right conditions so that what the brain finds first when something relevant comes up is not the threat learning, but the safety learning. So the old learning doesn't get erased. It's not going extinct. It gets outweighed by everything the brain learns after.